Let's shift focus to a growing rift between the US and South Africa that has forced other global powers to intervene. Europe has urged US President Donald Trump to reconsider his decision to bar the African nation from the G20 Summit next year.
It appears the confrontation between Cyril Ramaphosa's South Africa and US President Donald J. Trump is far from over. What started as a diplomatic disagreement has now grown into a full-scale political standoff. When South Africa refused to hand over the symbolic G20 leadership baton to a junior US official, something it viewed as deeply disrespectful, Trump did not let the moment pass. Instead, he struck back. He announced that South Africa would be barred from the 2026 G20 Summit in Miami, a decision that shook global diplomacy and stunned African leaders across the continent. And now, Europe is trying to jump in and calm the storm. European diplomats are quietly pushing for dialogue, hoping to pull both nations back from the edge. But the big questions remain. Will Trump reconsider his decision? Will Washington and Pretoria repair their damaged relationship? Or has this diplomatic rift become too deep to fix? In today's video, we dive into the tension, the politics, and the global stakes behind this unfolding battle. The 2025 G20 Summit in Johannesburg was meant to be a turning point, a historic moment where the world's biggest economies gathered on African soil for the very first time. It should have been a celebration of global cooperation. Instead, it spiraled into a political crisis that is still growing. Everything fell apart during a single moment. The traditional passing of the G20 gavel, the symbol of leadership. South Africa, as the host, was supposed to hand it over to the next president of the G20, the United States. But there was one problem. The US had boycotted the summit, refusing to send any top officials. Washington suggested that a junior embassy officer receive the gavel on its behalf. And that's where the storm began. South Africa refused. President Cyril Ramaphosa made it clear that handing over the G20 presidency to a junior staffer was unacceptable, an insult to the dignity and importance of the moment. And so, for the first time in G20 history, the public handover simply did not happen. Cameras rolled, the summit ended, and the gavel remained in South Africa's hands. What should have been a routine tradition suddenly became a global statement, one that the US viewed as a deliberate diplomatic snub. And from that moment on, the tension between Washington and Pretoria only escalated. But what came next from the United States made the situation even more explosive. Donald J. Trump had already refused to attend the Johannesburg summit, dismissing South Africa's leadership as disgraceful. Yet after the summit ended, he reacted with open anger. Trump announced that South Africa would be barred from the 2026 G20 Summit in Miami. His explanation? South Africa's refusal to hand over the G20 gavel to a junior US embassy representative. In other words, Washington skipped the summit, but still expected full diplomatic respect. When that didn't happen, Trump turned it into a global confrontation. Then he took it even further. Posting on his Truth Social platform, Trump defended his boycott by accusing South Africa of ignoring so-called human rights abuses against Afrikaners and other descendants of European settlers. He claimed the South African government was killing white people and letting their farms be taken, statements that shocked diplomats, angered South African officials, and reignited old controversial narratives. What was supposed to be a moment of global unity had now turned into a very public, very personal political battle, one with consequences far beyond a missed ceremony. But the claims Trump made were quickly exposed as false, even by white South African leaders themselves. No credible group in South Africa supports his accusations, yet Trump continues repeating them. Why he insists on using this narrative is still a mystery, and he didn't stop there. Trump went on to say South Africa is not a country worthy of membership anywhere, and announced that the US would stop all payments and subsidies to South Africa immediately. It was a dramatic escalation, an attempt to isolate South Africa on the global stage. The world waited to see how Pretoria would react. South Africa responded swiftly and firmly. President Cyril Ramaphosa called Trump's announcement regrettable, but made one thing very clear. South Africa is still a full and legitimate member of the G20. He reminded the world that G20 membership is not controlled by one man or by one country. It is a collective decision made by all members. Excluding a founding member because of a diplomatic disagreement, he argued, violates the very idea of global cooperation. In other words, South Africa wasn't backing down, and the standoff was only beginning. President Ramaphosa didn't just reject Trump's accusations. He called them what they were: misinformation and an insult to South Africa's sovereignty. Government officials across the country echoed the same message, saying the claims against a black majority government were not only false but deeply offensive. South Africa made its position unmistakably clear. They will not bow to threats, they will not accept humiliation, and they will continue to act as a rightful member of the G20. But the world was left wondering, can one powerful nation really remove a founding member from a global forum? If the answer is yes, then what does that say about multilateral institutions like the G20? And what does it mean for African countries watching a system that seems to reward power over diplomacy? This is where Europe suddenly stepped in. Trump tried to isolate South Africa, but instead, something surprising happened. Rather than supporting him, several major G20 nations immediately pushed back. Within days, European leaders made their stance public. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and even the European Commission all reminded the world that G20 membership is permanent and no host country can unilaterally expel another member. In simple terms, Trump's declaration had no legal basis. His announcement may have made headlines, but it did not carry the weight of international law, and Europe's response signaled that the standoff was far from over. One senior EU diplomat put it bluntly: "This is not how the G20 works. South Africa is a valued member and will remain so." That statement alone stunned Washington. Instead of supporting the United States, Europe openly backed South Africa. And then came an even bigger surprise. The United Kingdom, a country that almost always aligns with US foreign policy, broke ranks. London announced that South Africa is an essential global partner and warned that excluding it would damage the credibility of the G20. Suddenly, Trump's attempt to isolate South Africa was falling apart. The world was choosing diplomacy over division, and the pushback didn't stop in Europe. One by one, countries across the global south spoke out. Brazil, India, Indonesia, Argentina, Saudi Arabia. These nations made their position crystal clear. If South Africa is out, many of us will not attend. Trump had expected outrage. Instead, he got resistance. He had expected unity. Instead, he sparked the strongest display of global South solidarity seen in years. The message was simple and powerful. The G20 is not a club that one nation controls. Why did so many nations defend South Africa? The answer is simple. South Africa is the voice of an entire continent. It represents African interests in global forums where billions of lives are affected by the decisions of a few. Removing South Africa would mean silencing Africa at the world's most powerful economic table. And that is a line many nations refuse to cross. Meanwhile, China and Russia saw Trump's misstep as a golden opportunity. Both countries quickly moved in, strengthening diplomatic ties with South Africa, presenting themselves as true partners of Africa, and casting the United States as unreliable on the world stage. China called Trump's action unhelpful and unnecessary. Russia accused the US of undermining global cooperation. Suddenly, the political balance began shifting, and not in Washington's favor. But the most important voices came from inside the G20 itself. Officials from the organization stepped forward to answer the question everyone was asking. Can the United States actually stop South Africa from attending the 2026 summit? Their response would determine whether Trump's announcement was a real threat or just political theater. And what they said changed the entire conversation. According to the G20 organizers, the United States may host the summit and manage the logistics, but it has no legal authority to decide who can or cannot attend. Membership is permanent and cannot be altered by a single nation. In other words, Trump can host the 2026 summit, but he cannot control who sits at the table. And that means South Africa's place in the G20 is safe, at least for now. The threat made headlines, but legally, it holds no real power. But there's a deeper layer to Europe's reaction. Their pushback wasn't only about defending South Africa, it was about defending the G20 itself. European leaders know that if the host country is allowed to punish or exclude members, the entire institution could collapse into political chaos. And if that happens, the world's major economies lose their most important platform for cooperation. So by standing with South Africa, Europe was also protecting the stability of global governance and sending a warning that the G20 must remain bigger than the politics of any single nation. So what does all of this really mean? The drama surrounding the 2026 G20 Summit exposed something far bigger than a diplomatic argument. It revealed a deep shift in global power, a world where the United States, especially under Trump, no longer commands automatic obedience. There was a time when Washington's word was final. From the 1990s through the early 2000s, America stood unmatched, economically, militarily, and politically. If the US isolated a country, that country stayed isolated. If the US demanded support, allies complied. But that era is fading, and the cracks were visible at this year's G20 Summit. Trump expected the old world to snap back into place, that Europe would stand behind him, that the UK would follow his lead, that the rest of the G20 would fall in line. Instead, the opposite happened. Europe rejected his decision. The UK refused to support him. China and Russia openly opposed him, and nations across the global south rallied behind South Africa without hesitation. This had never happened before. The question is, why did so many countries finally push back? The pushback wasn't because the world suddenly fell in love with South Africa. It happened because countries are no longer afraid to say no to the United States. The global landscape has changed. China's economy is now nearly equal to America's. India is rising fast, set to become the world's third largest economy. Russia continues to challenge US influence, and the global south, once ignored, is forming powerful alliances that give developing nations a louder voice. This means one thing: the US is no longer the single center of global decision-making. Power is spreading, influence is diversifying, the world is becoming multipolar, and the G20 confrontation made this impossible to ignore. When the US tried to punish South Africa, other nations stepped forward, not out of friendship, but to protect fairness and balance. The message was clear: no country, not even America, can act alone anymore. This is the new global order, where cooperation matters more than dominance, and where nations are finally strong enough to challenge decisions they once accepted without question. For decades, America's power rested on fear. Fear of sanctions, fear of losing aid, fear of military pressure, fear of diplomatic punishment. But the world has changed. Countries now want cooperation, respect, and fairness, not threats. So when Trump tried to use the G20 as a weapon against South Africa, the global response was immediate and unified. We will not allow the G20 to be used for political revenge. That single message revealed just how much the world has shifted, and why this moment matters so deeply for Africa. For the first time in a long time, African nations saw something powerful. They can stand up to a superpower, and the world will listen. It showed that Africa is becoming too important, economically, politically, and strategically, to be ignored or bullied. What we are witnessing today is the birth of a multipolar world, a world with many centers of power, not just one. Yes, the United States remains influential, but it is no longer the only voice that shapes global decisions. The G20 confrontation exposed what global analysts have been warning for years. American dominance is fading, and a new international order is already taking shape, a world where alliances matter more than intimidation, and where Africa finally holds a seat that no one can take away. We may not always agree with Europe, but this time their decision to stand with South Africa deserves recognition. Europe didn't just reject Trump's order, they changed the direction of global diplomacy. Their message was sharp and unmistakable. The G20 is bigger than one country. This was the first time in many years that Europe collectively pushed back against an American president on such a major global issue. For decades, Europe has been known to quietly follow Washington's lead, but not this time. By refusing to support Trump's ban, Europe made it clear that the world's most important economic forum cannot be controlled by personal politics or national ego. And in defending South Africa, Europe was also defending something even bigger: the rules that hold global systems together. They were protecting multilateral cooperation, the legitimacy of international institutions, and the very credibility of the G20. Europe did not want the summit to become a battleground for personal feuds or political revenge. They wanted the G20 to remain a platform where nations work together, not a weapon for punishing those who refuse to submit. Before this incident, many believed the G20 was controlled entirely by giant powers like the US and China. But Europe's response changed that perception overnight. Their stance showed that the G20 is guided by principles, not personalities. It now has a clearer identity. No member can be removed at random, the host cannot control the guest list, and cooperation must continue even when nations disagree. These rules protect smaller countries like South Africa from being bullied, sidelined, or silenced by larger powers. Europe's support also opened a new door for Africa inside the G20. It proved that when Africa stands its ground, other global players will stand beside it. As a result, many nations in the global south now feel more confident and respected. They see the G20 not as a club for superpowers, but as a platform where every member, big or small, has a voice. And this shift will shape future debates on climate finance, debt relief, development funding, trade agreements, and global food security. In simple terms, Africa will now be much harder to ignore. But Europe's involvement revealed something deeper. They are tired of global chaos. With wars, economic uncertainty, and rising competition from China, Europe needs the G20 to remain stable and predictable. A fractured or divided G20 would weaken Europe's influence and leave the world more dangerous. So defending South Africa wasn't only about fairness, it was also about protecting Europe's own strategic interests. By standing firm, they sent a quiet but powerful message. The United States cannot decide everything alone. Even America's closest allies are no longer willing to follow without question. This moment may be remembered as a turning point, a quiet moment when the global balance began to change. A moment when the old system of one dominant power slowly gave way to a world that is more equal, more multipolar, and more willing to challenge unfair decisions. What do you think about this new global order? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dive documentaries.